Greetings! Welcome to the Mind of Brandon. That's me, I'm Brandon, and on my mind today is Zeitgeist. I think it's interesting that over a decade after Peter Joseph first uploaded the Zeitgeist movie to the internet, people are still coming onto YouTube to post videos and comments arguing with each other about the validity of the movie's content. Now, when I first watched Zeitgeist, I really wasn't the kind of person to fact-check a documentary. I pretty much just assumed that everything in there was true. Although I was a little bit confused when it said that the Egyptian god Horus was a sun god. I was pretty sure that the sun god of Egypt was Ra. But then it occurred to me that maybe Horus is just another name for Ra. You know, like how Jupiter is another name for Zeus. So I just shrugged it off and figured that the narrator knew what he was talking about. But there was all sorts of other people who did not shrug it off, and I started noticing that there were all these videos all over YouTube that were claiming to have debunked Zeitgeist. And when I watched them, it was like they were saying that Zeitgeist was lying about damn near everything, right? So I was kind of skeptical of that, but I knew that the only way I was going to figure out what was actually going on is if I started researching the stuff for myself. So I jumped on Wikipedia to see what it said about Horus. Keep in mind this was a decade ago, so the article has probably been through some modifications since then. But I noticed that it seemed to support what debunkers were saying more than what Zeitgeist was saying. Remember, Zeitgeist has said that Horus was a sun god, but the debunkers were saying
Horus isn't a sun god. He's the god of the sky. Ra is the sun god.
But I knew there was a good chance that neither Wikipedia or the debunkers were telling the full story. And it occurred to me that maybe there are different versions of Horus. You know, like how there's different versions of King Arthur or Little Red Riding Hood or Robin Hood. So I jumped on my search engine and I typed in different versions of Horus to see what would pop up. And I came across this website called Tour Egypt. Now, again, this was a decade ago. The website has been completely remodeled since then, so it's not the same. But when I was there a decade ago, it had a really thorough article about Horus. It had good scholarly references cited, and it did in fact confirm that there were different versions of Horus, and some of them were sun gods. Now, the good news is you don't have to take me at my word about the validity of the information on this extinct web article, because you can find the information elsewhere. Take, for example, The Ancient Godspeak, A Guide to Egyptian Religion. This is an Oxford Press encyclopedia with over 50 scholarly contributions, and it's edited by the renowned Egyptologist Donald Redford. On a section on Horus, the Egyptologist Edmund Meltzer says, "The roles, local cult foundations, and titles or epithets of Horus are sometimes correlated with distinct or preferred forms in iconography. For example, the falcon-headed man, the winged disc, the child with a sidelock, sometimes in his mother's arms. Egyptologists, therefore, often speak of distinct, sometimes originally distinct, Horuses or Horus gods. Combinations, identifications, and differentiations were, however, possible for Horus, and they are complementary rather than antithetical. A judicious examination of the various Horuses and the sources relating to them supports the possibility that the roles in question are closely interrelated, and so they may be understood as different aspects or facets of the same divine persona." Later, he goes on to explain Horus the falcon was predominantly a sky god and a sun god. As the former, his eyes are the sun and moon. As the latter, he has a sun disk on his head and is syncretized with the deity Re. most often as Re Harakti. In a section on Re and Re Harakti, Egyptologist Maya Muller clarifies, Re is the sun god. His Egyptian name is usually written with the sun disk. He is often called Re Harakti. Re is Horus of the horizon. Muller also goes on to say, from the beginning, the king appeared as a god and a human at once. His divine aspect was embodied in a falcon named Horus. In the 4th dynasty, the reigning king was called the son of Re, thus defining the relationship between pharaoh and sun god. A relationship was also established between the royal falcon and Re, by uniting both in the symbol of the winged sun disk. So, apparently when it occurred to me that Horus might be just another name for Ra, that actually wasn't too far off. So, just as the Greek and Roman gods will typically syncretize, that is apparently what happened with Ra and Horus. So, evidently, Zeitgeist was right. Horus was a sun god. These debunkers were saying that Horus was not a sun god. Well, they're wrong. In fact, in the words of Professor Glenn Holland, Horus's identity as sun god is his primary identity. But what about these parallels that Zeitgeist points out between Horus and Jesus? I mean, Zeitgeist says that Horus was born on December 25th. He was born of a virgin, crucified and resurrected, things like that. Is any of this true? Well, if you guys want to find out, then you'll just have to watch my next video. So, to be continued, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one. So have a good one, guys, and peace. Hey guys, welcome back to The Mind of Brandon, and welcome back to some more Zeitgeist discussion. So, to recap, in last week's video, we talked about how, regardless of what debunkers were saying, it turns out that Zeitgeist is actually right about Horus being a sun god. But does that mean that Zeitgeist is right about everything? And what about all the parallels it points out between Horus and Jesus?
Hey guys, thanks for joining me. Today we're going to be debunking the movie Zeitgeist. So basically the movie Zeitgeist was released in 2007. It's a conspiracy theory movie, and the whole first part of the movie, the first 50 minutes of it, is trying to assert that the story of Jesus is completely fabricated. The story of Jesus actually originated among pagan gods, specifically mostly Egyptian gods, well before Jesus' time. They tried saying that there are plenty of other gods that were born of virgins on December 25th, had 12 disciples, crucified, they use the word crucified, died for 3 days and rose again. And they tried making a claim that there's hundreds of gods before Jesus that did so. So let's go and check it out. Let's start with the first god, Horus, which is supposed to be the sun god from 3000 BC.
This is Horus. He is the sun god of Egypt of around 3000 BC. Broadly speaking, the story of Horus is as follows. Horus was born on December 25th of the Virgin Isis Mary.
Alright, so this is the first fabricated lie that Zeitgeist tries to use. Horus was not born on December 25th. Horus was actually born around August.
Yeah, except that when the Egyptians first started celebrating the birth of Horus, the month of August didn't even exist. It hadn't been invented yet. Right? Don't get me wrong, it's totally okay to translate from an ancient calendar to a modern one. I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that we've been through different calendars, right? The Gregorian calendar that we presently use here in the United States is actually originally a Roman calendar, which was adapted from an even earlier Roman calendar known as the Julian calendar, which also was adapted from an earlier Roman calendar that had 10 months on it instead of 12. In fact, that's actually why the month of December has the prefix Deca. Deca as in 10. Originally it was the 10th month, not the 12th, and of course, there was no month of August on it. Now, the point here is, just as the Romans went through all these different calendars, switching around when certain festivities took place, well, the Egyptians did that too. In fact, even different debunkers have pointed out different birthdays associated with Horus in their attempts to debunk this December 25th parallel. Some of them have pointed out his epagamental birthday at the end of the Egyptian year, whereas others have pointed out his birthday in the Egyptian month of Koyak. But I should point out that sometimes the difference between one birthday and another has to do with what kind of birth does it represent. Is it the birth of a babe, or is it the rebirth of an adult? In the words of Egyptologist Gerald Massey, the double birth of Horus at the two times, or the birth of the babe in the winter solstice, and the rebirth as the adult in the Easter equinox, is acknowledged in the Egyptian Book of the Divine Birth. The celebration of the Nativity at the solstice is referred to in the calendar Edfu. Now, notice how Massey is actually citing primary sources here, which I mentioned because he's a reference that's often shat all over by Zeitgeist debunkers, who often stoop to making personal attacks on his credibility.
Gerald Massey, English poet and amateur Egyptologist. Not an expert, not an academic, not actually an historian at all.
Says the guy who didn't even know Horus was a sun god. He calls Massey an amateur Egyptologist and says he's not even a historian. But Professor Forbes himself is not even an Egyptologist, and he doesn't even address the archaeological evidence that Massey cites. Gerald Massey closely worked with and was peer-reviewed by the leading Egyptologists of his day. And Horus's birthday around the time of the winter solstice is something that even ancient scholars sometimes talk about. For example, Plutarch, who tells us, "It is said that Isis, when she perceived that she was pregnant, put upon herself an amulet on the 6th day of the month of Phalphi, and about the time of the winter solstice, she gave birth to Harpocrates, imperfect and premature." Harpocrates, of course, is a version of Horus, represented in the form of a child. According to Egyptologist Bojana Mojsov, the symbol of the savior child was the eye of the sun newly born every year at the winter solstice. And, Professor Orlando Schmidt explains, as the sun of the Sothiac year reached the winter solstice, in the 17th year of the reign of King Amenemhes I, he assumed the title of Nemestu, meaning reborn, in commemoration of his birth as Harpocrates. So there's actually a pretty solid case that can be made for this December 25th birthday parallel. But the truth is, I've really only just scratched the surface in this video. If you guys want to see a more thorough approach, I recommend checking out D.M. Murdoch's Christ in Egypt, the Horus-Jesus Connection. D.M. Murdoch is another one of the Zeitgeist references that has been just shat all over by the debunkers. But this book is basically a response to those debunkers. And I gotta say, I think she did a really good job with it. Well, for the most part. Even I don't agree with all of her conclusions. I do think that some of the parallels that get pointed out are kind of a stretch. Maybe blowing things out of proportion a bit. But in my investigation of this subject, I've determined that regardless of what Zeitgeist might be wrong about, it's certainly nowhere near as full of crap as the debunkers are making it out to be.
Basically, what's going on is Zeitgeist is trying to compare Horus with the Christmas story of Jesus. The reason why I say Christmas story is because there is absolutely no mention of Jesus ever being born on December 25th. That's just a Christmas tradition.
He says, completely missing the point, that Christmas is basically just a Christianized hijacking of a pagan winter solstice celebration. Just as so many other things have been handed down to Christian tradition from pagan tradition, the same is true of Christmas. So it seems that so far, Zeitgeist has been right about Horus being a sun god, and it has been right about Horus having a birthday associated with the winter solstice. But this doesn't mean that Zeitgeist is going to be right about everything. What about this claim that Horus was born of the Virgin Isis Mary? Is Zeitgeist right about that? Well, if you guys want to know, you're just going to have to watch my next video. So, to be continued, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one. So have a good one, guys, and peace. Hey guys, welcome back to The Mind of Brandon, and welcome back to some more discussion of Zeitgeist. So to recap, in the first part of this series, we determined that regardless of what debunkers were saying, Zeitgeist was actually right about the Egyptian god Horus being a sun god. And in the second part, we determined that regardless of what debunkers were saying, Zeitgeist was also right about Horus having a birthday associated with what we now consider to be December 25th. But of course, just because Zeitgeist was right about those things, doesn't mean it was right about everything. So let's continue to investigate Zeitgeist's claims.
Broadly speaking, the story of Horus is as follows. Horus was born on December 25th of the Virgin Isis Mary.
As for Horus, he also had no virgin birth. Isis had sex with Osiris after reassembling his body parts, which were torn apart and scattered over Egypt.
Well, obviously in that particular myth, Horus is not born of a virgin. But something we established in the very first part of this series is that there are different versions of Horus. So, don't you think that means there's probably different versions of Isis too? There are. In fact, Isis isn't even always considered Horus's mother. If we're going off the etiological myth associated with the Apagamental days that occur at the end of the Egyptian year, well, in that continuity, Isis is actually Horus's younger sister. Not that much younger. He's born on the second Apagamental day. She's born on the fourth. But if that's the one that you were exposed to, if that was the myth you knew about, then the argument you'd be making is, what? Zeitgeist thinks that Isis is the mother of Horus? That's ridiculous. She's Horus's little sister, right? Zeitgeist lies. Zeitgeist debunked. According to Egyptologist Dr. Ray Witt, the Egyptian goddess who was equally the Great Virgin and Mother of the God was the object of the very same praise bestowed upon her successor, Mary, Virgin Mother of Jesus. And Dr. James Curl agrees. Isis was the sacred embodiment of motherhood, yet was known as the Great Virgin, an apparent contradiction that will be familiar to Christians. Here's one of the inscriptions where Isis is referred to as the Great Virgin. In the left corner, you can see it was originally interpreted as the Great Maiden, but that maiden can be used synonymously with virgin. And, according to reports from Plutarch and Proclus, at the Egyptian site of Sais, there was a statue that some of the Egyptians regarded as Isis, and the statue came with an autobiographical inscription in which the goddess claims to have begotten the sun god. She also states that no one had lifted her mantle, which would seem to imply that the sun god was virgin-born. Now, one of the forms the sun god took was the winged beetle pushing the ball of the sun, like we see in this image from the Edfu Temple of Horus. Just as we see Horus and Ra combined in the image of the winged disc, the winged scarab pushing the sun associates Horus with another sun god called Khepru, the sacred dung beetle, a god that represents the daily renewal of the sun, reborn every morning. Now, the main reason I even bring up Khepru, apart from his association with Horus, is just simply the fact that he's a scarab. One of the interesting things that the Egyptologist Bob Breyer talks about in his lecture series on the history of ancient Egypt is how the Egyptians thought that scarabs were a special kind of animal that only came in one gender, right? They thought that scarabs could reproduce without having sex, right? They just never caught them in the act. Suffice it to say, there seems to be plenty of justification for this idea that Horus was born of a virgin. But what about this Isis Mary thing?
And it says born of the virgin Isis Mary. Isis was not a virgin, and there's absolutely no correlation between the name Isis and Mary.
Oh, well, you guys heard the debunker. He says that there's no correlation between Isis and Mary. So there it is settled.
Isis Mary.
Wait, what?
Isis Mary. Isis Mary. Isis Mary.
According to my hieroglyphic detective, written by the Egyptologist Nigel Strudwick, the Egyptian word Mary just means beloved. Okay, and it's actually pretty common. You'll commonly see Mary attached to this name or that one, pretty much all over the place. So kind of like how we have a bunch of Marys in the New Testament, we also have a bunch of Marys in Egypt. How many Marys are in the New Testament, you ask? Well, Mary, mother of Jesus, of course. Mary Magdalene. Mary, sister of Martha and Lazarus. Mary, mother of James and Joses. Mary, wife of Cleophas. Mary, mother of John Mark. And Mary of Romans. So, once again, it appears the debunkers did not look far enough into this stuff. And once again, Zeitgeist is right. But this doesn't mean Zeitgeist is going to be right about everything. What about this stuff about Horus having a star in the east, signaling his birth, being adorned by 3 kings? Did Horus actually have 12 disciples? Well, if you guys want to find out if there's any validity to that stuff, then you're just going to have to tune in to my next video. So, to be continued, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one. So have a good one, guys, and peace. Hey guys, welcome back to The Mind of Brandon, and welcome back to some more discussion of Zeitgeist. So, to recap, in the first part of this series, we established that, regardless of what debunkers were saying, Zeitgeist is actually right about the Egyptian god Horus being a sun god. Then, in the second part, we determined that, regardless of what debunkers are saying, Zeitgeist is actually right about Horus having a birthday associated with December 25th. Then in the third part, we determined that regardless of what debunkers are saying, Zeitgeist is actually right about Horus being born of the Virgin Isis Mary. But this of course doesn't mean that Zeitgeist is right about everything. So we will continue looking at Zeitgeist's claims, seeing what the debunkers have to say about them, and then figuring out who's right and, well, who's wrong.
His birth was accompanied by a star in the east, which, in turn, 3 kings followed to locate and adorn the newborn Savior.
So in the story of Horus, there is no star in the east. There's another fabricated lie, and he was not adorned by 3 kings upon his birth.
Dude, I know this is just going to shock the hell out of a lot of Zeitgeist debunkers, but it does turn out that ancient Egypt did have more than one story. If you don't believe me, then you should check out this book on the literature of ancient Egypt. There's a bunch of different stories in here. The very first story is one called King Cheops and the Magicians, which actually has a nativity scene in it that has some interesting parallels to the biblical nativity scene. That being said, our Egyptian nativity scene does have 3 kings. There's some gift giving, Isis is there, and we should make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that Isis is associated with the star Sirius. Sirius is also known as Sothis. But anyway, in this Egyptian story, it's actually the three kings who are being born. They're the ones who are going to be presented with gifts. This does not mean that Horus is not born in this story. Actually, in Egypt, there's this tradition where the king is considered to be an incarnation of Horus. Now, that does not mean that the king is the totality of Horus's existence. The king is a form that Horus takes. Another one would be the sun god Re. Re is Horus of the horizon. That being said, these three kings are referred to in this story as sons of Re. This is another tradition in ancient Egypt, the idea that the pharaoh is son of the sun god Re. The individual who's giving birth to them is a priestess of Re. So what's Isis's role in all this? Well, she's the one who is delivering the three kings. And you'd think that this would mean, she'd be sitting there talking to the mother, push, But no, instead she's actually talking to the children who are in the mother's womb. She's giving them instructions. And so these three kings inside the womb of their mother, they follow Isis. They follow her instructions, right? And so they start popping out one at a time. Now, once the three kings are born, Isis and the three goddesses that are with her perform acts of magicianry. They magically bring about these gifts to bestow upon these children, things like crowns, stuff like that. But since the three kings are forms that Horus is taking, you can kind of look at it as though Horus is the one receiving those gifts via the three kings. But you don't need to have an astrotheological interpretation of the story of King Cheops and the magicians to be able to put in perspective that the birth of Horus was associated with the three king stars in Orion's belt and the star Sirius, which of course is the star that Zeitgeist is referring to as the star in the east. In the words of Egyptologist Dr. John Gwynne Griffiths, Sothis was the harbinger of the annual inundation of the Nile through her appearance with the rising sun at the time when the inundation was due to begin. The bright star would therefore naturally become, together with the conjoined constellation of Orion, the sign and symbol of new vegetation which the year then beginning would infallibly bring with it. And, in the words of Egyptologist James Allen, the morning star, Sirius, seen by the Egyptians as a goddess. In Egypt, the star disappears below the horizon once a year for a period of some 70 days. Its reappearance in midsummer marked the beginning of the annual inundation and the Egyptian year. The star's rising was also seen as a harbinger of the sunrise and therefore associated with Horus in his solar aspect, occasionally specified as Horus and Sothis, Sothic Horus, or Sharp Horus. And according to the Egyptologist Siegfried Schott, the Egyptian New Year actually opened with a birthday for a version of Horus called Ra Harakti. Let's keep in mind, though, that there were other versions of Horus that had birthdays at other times. Just a few days prior to Ra Harakti, Horus the Elder had a birthday, and of course, Harpocrates has a birthday around the time of the winter solstice. And let's not forget, there's also the concept that the sun is reborn on a daily basis. So, once again, Zeitgeist is right. Horus did have a birthday associated with the star in the east, Sirius, as well as three kings, the three king stars in Orion's belt.
And there is no mention of there being three kings at the birth of Jesus. It talks about there's wise men that are present, but never three kings. And even the wise men, there's no number of wise men. It just says there were wise men that were present at the birth of Jesus. So they're trying to compare Horus with the Christmas story of Jesus, and even then they're failing to do so because they're throwing a lot of fabricated lies at you.
Okay, once again, you're losing sight of the fact that we're talking about the origins of Christian tradition. There are certain aspects of Christian tradition that have been just kind of handed down from pagan tradition. That does include some of what's in the Bible, okay? But it's not exclusive to what's in the Bible. There's Christian tradition outside the Bible. You need to keep in mind that the Bible is itself, at least in its current form, with both Old Testament and New Testament, that is a product of Christian tradition. not the other way around. Some people are confused about that. They think that Christianity is a product of the Bible when it's actually the other way around. Christianity predates the Bible. Christianity is what brought us the Bible in its present form. And it is Christian tradition that's responsible for associating the Magi with three kings. In fact, it's Christians who originally looked up at the three king stars in Orion's belt and said, hey, it's the Magi! That being said, I'm not going to address all the parallels that are being disputed by debunkers. I mainly just wanted to focus on the ones that I view to be most important. So let's go ahead and skip ahead a bit.
Horus had 12 disciples he traveled about with.
There were no 12 disciples, that's also a lie.
Oh, really? Well, there's Horus enthroned before 12 disciples. Or at least 12 figures representing the 12 hours of the day. Not to be confused with the 12 hours of night. Calling them disciples might be a bit of an exaggeration, and that is something that Zeitgeist does sometimes. And this is a point I really want to bring home, because I'm not doing this series to say that Zeitgeist is right about everything, right? It's not, okay? There is some stuff it's wrong about. But, you know, debunkers, they're acting like every single parallel it points out is just a blatant frickin' lie, right? And that's just not true, okay? A lot of this stuff, you know, a lot of the parallels it points out, well, it's right. Sometimes, though, when it's pointing out a parallel, it blows the parallel out of proportion. It makes it seem even more like something from Christian tradition than, you know, is actually the case. Now, what a lot of you have been waiting for, which you probably really want to know, is, you know, is there any validity to this stuff about Horus being crucified and resurrected? And, well, if you want to find out, then you're just going to have to watch my next video. So, to be continued, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And I will see you all in the next one. So have a good one, guys, and peace. Hey guys, welcome back to The Mind of Brandon, and welcome back to some more discussion of Zeitgeist. So, to recap, in previous videos we established that regardless of what debunkers say, Zeitgeist is actually right about Horus being a sun god. It was also right about him having a birthday associated with December 25th, and it was also right about him being born of the Virgin Isis Mary. And it was also right about him having a birth associated with the star in the east and three kings. And it was also right about him having 12 followers. But we also determined that Zeitgeist isn't right about everything, and sometimes it does exaggerate. But what about this stuff about Horus being crucified and resurrected?
And the movie claims that Horus is from 3000 BC, which by far predates the practice of crucifixion. So there's no possible way that Horus could have ever been crucified. So no, he was not crucified.
Yeah, this is actually a perfect example of a situation where Zeitgeist is exaggerating what would be an otherwise perfectly legit parallel. But yeah, both the creator of Zeitgeist and one of its references will admit that the stuff about Horus being crucified, you know, it's not based on a story where Horus is nailed to a cross. There's no claims in any Egyptian inscriptions that this happens. There's no, you know, artwork depicting it. There is, however, artwork that depicts Horus in some kind of cruciform or in some other way associated with cross symbolism. So you might see Horus with outstretched arms or outstretched wings. You might see the sun being raised above an Egyptian cross. My personal favorite, though, is the scarab. As we established in a previous video, one version of Horus found in artwork is the winged scarab, also associated with the sun god Khepri, a symbol of resurrection. Here that symbol of resurrection is on an Egyptian cross. symbol for eternal life. It may be misleading to say Horus was crucified, since it conjures up images of him nailed to a cross, and all sorts of people who watch Zeitgeist may now believe that this is something the Egyptians wrote about Horus. But regardless of whether Horus was actually nailed to a cross or not, there's certainly a legit parallel to be pointed out with regard to symbolism.
Actually, the story of Horus, he never died. He actually merged with the sun god Re. So Horus never actually died, never crucified, never resurrected. This is all completely fabricated lies.
Well, I guess you missed the part about the sun being swallowed every night and reborn every morning. Also, the ancient historian Diodorus does tell us about a story where Isis finds Horus dead, and she resurrects him. Also, you got to keep in mind that traditionally the pharaoh was considered an incarnation of Horus, and well, the pharaohs always died, right? But it was believed that they would resurrect. In fact, there were spells written to ensure a successful resurrection. Early on in Egyptian history, it was believed that only the pharaoh could resurrect, but later in history, everyone is saved, right? Anyone can resurrect. They just have the right spells or charms or whatever, right? So again, Zeitgeist might not be right about everything, but it's also certainly nowhere near as full of crap as the debunkers are making it out to be. There is definitely pagan influence on Christian tradition, okay? There's all sorts of stuff that Christianity has most certainly appropriated from earlier tradition. That being said, if there's anyone new to my channel who enjoyed this series, you might also get a kick out of my Skeptic Bible Study lecture series. That's a playlist that I have on my YouTube channel. Also, you might enjoy Sunday Science and Spirituality. That's another playlist that I have. Yeah, I like to do a really thorough debunking of people's religious beliefs. Alright guys, that's it for this series. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and share it with other people. If you're interested in watching my future videos, please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one. So have a good one, guys, and peace.